Hi there, my name is Amanda. I am a hand embroidery artist, and in this video I wanted to share with you a little bit of what I know about crewel embroidery. I am by no means an expert in crewel embroidery, but I like to dabble in all different kinds and styles of embroidery. So I wanted to share with you some of the different yarns I like to use and just kind of generally go over it. So crewel embroidery is actually not much different than any other kind of surface embroidery. It uses a lot of the same embroidery stitches, but the defining characteristic of it is that you use wool instead of any other kind of thread or floss. So generally, a lot of people will use cotton embroidery floss, which is what I use a lot. But with crewel embroidery, you use wool yarn. And yarn is non-divisible, so instead of having strands that you can separate, there's several pieces of thread that are basically spun together, and if you undo them, which you technically can, it would basically undo the structure of the yarn, so you don't want to undo it. So you want to stitch at the entire piece or strand of wool while you're stitching. One of the things that looks a little bit different with crewel embroidery is that it's a little bit of a fluffier texture. Wool has a very distinctive texture to it. There's a lot of fibers to it, so it looks a little bit fuzzier and fluffier. I wanted to quickly share a couple of brands that I like to use. There are many out there, but these are some of the most common ones that I've come across and ones that I've personally tested out. So the very first one I wanted to go over is actually one from another small business, Stuart Morris Textiles. So Stuart Morris Textiles has this beautiful hand-dyed yarn. It's very fluffy and has a little bit of stretchiness to it, and I just think the colors are so beautiful. You can tell they're hand-dyed because there's some irregularities in the colors, which I personally really like. I think that it has a lot of character to it because of that. So that would be one of the first places you can look. I will link everything down below, but this one is available on Etsy. And then the next one that is a UK brand is called Appleton's Wool. And Appleton's Wool is very similar in texture. It's a little bit thinner than the previous one I just mentioned, Stuart Morris Textiles. It is also very fuzzy. I like to double up both of these and stitch with 2 strands at a time. I don't always do that, but I think that it makes the texture look really nice and it adds a lot of dimension to your work. So these two are really great to do that. And Appleton's Wool makes a ton of different colors, so there's a lot of variety in what color options you'll have. The next one that I like to use is actually a newer brand, and it's called Array Yarn. This yarn is a little bit different than the other two I just mentioned. I feel like the strands are a little bit more compact, so it's a little bit better for adding in finer details. So it's a little less fluffy, but it's really, really nice to use, and I just really like the colors that they carry. Another one that I have tried is this tapestry yarn by DMC. This is specifically more for like actual like tapestry and needlepoint projects, but you can also use it in surface embroidery. It's just a little bit thicker. So I think this may have more than 2 plies to it. I'm not entirely sure actually. It may be more. I can't really tell off just like looking at it, but it is a lot thicker than the other 3 that I just mentioned. So if you want something that's really fluffy, these would be great. And these also come in a really large variety of colors. DMC is a very well-established brand with high quality threads and flosses, and DMC is normally what I use for cotton embroidery floss, so they have a lot of different color options. The next thing you would need is a chenille or a crewel embroidery needle. Because you're using thicker yarn, you'll want something that has a larger eye on it, so crewel and chenille needles are generally the way to go. I would recommend just getting a variety pack because depending on what style of yarn you're using, it can be a little bit different with how thick it is. So just having a couple of different sizes on hand would be really helpful. If you're interested in purchasing some sort of resource for crewel embroidery, there are a few out there. It's a little bit harder to find because it's just not a super popular style of embroidery like say regular like surface embroidery with cotton embroidery floss. but the embroidery stitches are essentially the same. I would just say if you're interested in more of the historical reference and imagery of Crewel Embroidery, it does have a pretty distinctive look to it from a long time ago. And I actually have a few books that I found at the thrift store. So the thrift store is first off a great place to look. You could do whatever you want image-wise, but I feel like some of the most defining images are ones that have a lot of botanicals, and they're almost a little bit more abstract and kind of folk arty in a way. Not all Crewel looks like that, but I just feel like a lot of the designs in this book, you can kind of see there's a trend, there's kind of like a pattern to it. So I really like this book because I love to see all the imagery and I like to read about the history of everything. Crewel has been around for hundreds of years, and so it's a very interesting thing to read up on. There is another book called Royal School of Needlework Book of Embroidery, and they have a bunch of different styles of embroidery in it. That is probably the most comprehensive embroidery book I personally own, but they do have a section that has embroidery stitches using Crewel wool, so it looks more like just regular Crewel work instead of doing everything with cotton. So you can essentially use whatever embroidery stitches you want with Crewel work. It is very similar to surface embroidery in that way. There are some stitches that lend themselves even better for Crewel work because you can make them look very interesting. Some examples would be the couching stitch. That would be a really great one, especially to use for different kinds of weights of yarn to kind of fill in an area that way. There's also stitches like the basket weave stitch, and you can also use outline stitches like a stem stitch or a back stitch. There's so many different ones you can use. It's just fun to kind of experiment with wool instead of using cotton because it does end up having a very different end result to it. It looks very different. So the next thing that I wanted to do is just kind of hop into a little pattern I drew up. I have a couple of different embroidery stitches that I'm using on it, and I just wanted to transition into this part of the video and allow you to kind of see the different stitches that you can use and how they would look with wool yarn. I do have a blog post that has some of these traceable images available for download, so if you want, I will link that blog post in the description below. And yeah, let's get into it. Because Crewel yarn is a little bit thicker, it can be a little bit harder to thread, so here's an easy way to do it. Fold the yarn across the needle and pull it tight, and then you're just gonna pinch the very top of it. Keep it pinched, and then take your needle and place it right directly on that little pinched piece of the yarn, and you should be able to thread it. So this is one of the areas that I like to double up my yarn. So I'm just gonna do lazy daisy stitches on these little flowers here. And I don't like to pull it too tight. I like to keep it kind of fluffy. And I just do that along each of the petals, and it makes a very cute little flower.